1.3, which includes 3 papers which will be exploring international perspectives on and context for higher education. First paper from Rachel Brooks and Lee Rensma from SRHE and UCL, which is looking at HE, higher education actors' responses to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. The second from Uday Tozan, who's based at the University of Cambridge, but actually in Sydney today. So that's why he's looking happy and tanned and enjoying himself. And he's looking at peeling away the multiple layers of inequalities in higher education by exploring the case of Syria. And the third paper, colleagues based in France, Zakaria Babutsidze and Natalia Timus, who are from Côte d'Azur in Nice, and the Schema Business School in Valbonne, and they'll be looking at inclusive global educators for the 21st century. There's 20 minutes for each paper and around 10 minutes for Q&A. So we will need to try and stick to time because we've got 90 minutes for this session. So each paper, the colleagues will talk for 20 minutes. If you want to post questions in the chat, I'll keep an eye on the chat and try and come to you for the Q&A, but also just put your hand up when we get to the Q&A and I'll pick out your question from that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Rachel and Lee.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. So as Chris said, we're going to be talking about European higher education actors' responses to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And we're going to be doing this through analysing what we're calling geopolitical spatial imaginaries, which we will explain shortly. So this has been funded by the ESRC through the Centre for Global Higher Education that Lee and I are both part of. So next slide, please, Lee. So just a few words of introduction. As I'm sure you are all aware, the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 met with widespread condemnation across Europe, including by many higher education bodies. I suppose we're starting from the premise that the statements made by these various higher education policy actors provide a lens through which to explore broader questions about European higher education. And within the literature, I suppose Ukraine has occupied quite an interesting position. Some people have argued that with respect to debates about Europeanization, this is something that has occurred primarily within members of the European Union, so not Ukraine. Whereas others have argued that as a result of initiatives such as the Bologna process, the creation of a European higher education area, this has effectively expanded the borders of Europe to include nations such as Ukraine. So I suppose we're engaging with some of those debates within the academic literature. And the two research questions that we set out to answer are, first of all, what spatial imaginaries pertaining to higher education are evident in statements about the Ukraine conflict issued by higher education actors across Europe? And secondly, what do these statements reveal about the role of higher education actors as normative policy actors shaping spatial imaginaries? Next slide, please, Lee. And just a few words about spatial imaginaries, as this is the sort of the theoretical concept that we've been using in our research. So it's argued by Watkins and various others coming from human geography that spatial imaginaries are socially held stories that constitute particular ways of talking about spaces and places. And it's often argued that these imaginaries can have agency of their own and can actually shape material practices, not just the ways we think about things. And various scholars have applied this concept to Europe. So, for example, in political science, there's been some literature about what's called the spatial imaginary of the Mediterranean neighbourhood, the links in the southern Mediterranean between EU nation states and nations outside the EU. There's been analysis of Brexit spatial imaginaries in the UK and elsewhere from sort of 2016 onwards. And then focusing on kind of Europe more generally, Rupert and Shear, sociologists, have argued that there are multiple imaginaries of Europe, and the Europe means quite profoundly different things to different stakeholders. But although there is this literature, the role of higher education is largely overlooked in this area, and I suppose we're hoping to contribute to that. Next slide, please, Lee. And it's over to you, I think, Lee, now, isn't it?
Okay, so the analysis that we develop in our study also draws on literature on the relationship between higher education and geopolitical forces. So that can be viewed as having a two-directional relationship. On the one side, you have the impact of geopolitical forces on higher education and on universities, with studies highlighting how national higher education sectors and universities are subject to those forces. And that's been evidenced in research on the impact of colonialism, both old and new forms, as well as the Eurocentric hegemony, which strongly affects how science is practiced across the world. There's also a resurgent nationalism seen in Europe and elsewhere, driven by fears of power being exerted from above by the European Union or from below by the upward mobility of migrants. And that's led to a reduction in international student enrollments in certain European countries. But concurrently, studies also observe the active roles universities can play in geopolitical processes. And this is most commonly seen within frameworks which take a view to higher education as a tool of national governments to exert geopolitical influence, using international scholarships or academic partnerships, or in how universities carry out border management functions through surveilling international students. Now, a small subset of that literature also highlights the geopolitical influence that universities can exert on their own. And this can be seen where national governments and universities hold different positions on internationalization and migration, such as British universities during Brexit. And they pursue distinct international agendas, which to some degree circumvent national policy. So what these contributions critically highlight is the agency of universities in affecting geopolitics alongside and sometimes in tension with national governments. So in our study, we examined public statements, specifically web pages, announcements, and open letters from a broad sample of national and regional higher education organizations responding to the outbreak of conflict between Russia and Ukraine in early 2022. Our aim was to observe how geopolitical positions with regards to Ukraine and Russia were articulated variously by different higher education actors across Europe. So our sample contained 55 statements in total, with one from each actor constituting a sample, which was not systematically representative, given that we first determined the countries and the actor types, but we did follow a stringent selection criteria with regards to statement dates, whether there were single or multiple statements, and where there were sometimes several possible actors in each category. So of the 55 statements, 42 were national actors across 6 countries: France, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Spain, and the UK, specifically England. So for each of these countries, we collected statements from the rectors' conferences, or the equivalent, the Universities UK in this case, national research funding bodies, government departments responsible for higher education, so national unions of students and of staff, the organizations responsible for promoting student mobility, like British Council or DAAD in Germany, and then 2 universities in each country. And we tried to select those universities with differences between them based on their sizes or when they were established. So we also collected 13 statements from various European regional level actors, which included the European Commission, the Bologna follow-up group of the higher education area, the Universities Association, the Academic Cooperation Association, the University Students Union, the Staff Union as well. And as well, we had the university networks like the Guild, Coimbra, Eurash, as well as some of the new alliances that were formed as a result of the university's initiative, the UI. So 3 of those alliances, and plus their larger collective bodies. Now, just 2 quick caveats here is that, firstly, some actors have material governing power, right? That the funding agencies, the European Commission, while others are strictly discursive. They wield a discursive influence or normative power, such as the unions and the European university networks. So that's a key difference between some of the actors here, which we'll get to in the findings. But also the statements, they varied quite markedly in length. some of them, and no consistency by actor type. So some could be as pithy as a couple sentences, while others were upwards of 800 words. And just to show you here that the study design, it lent itself really nicely to a charting framework analysis, where we could put these so-called variables into a three-dimensional analysis, at least for the national actors. So we could analyze by country, by actor type, as according to our research questions, as you can see in an example here. So those research questions included where are the alignments or nuances between the responses of social actors or the various actors? How is Ukraine included in associative statements about the European higher education space? And conversely, how is Russia and Belarus excluded from that space in the statements? And then lastly, what distinctions are drawn between state-based actors on the one hand and individuals, dissident Russian scientists or students in actors' public statements. So then we'll walk you through some of the findings.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so I want to talk about the spatial framing of the position statements. I'm going to first talk about the European regional actors and then the national actors that we looked at. And it was interesting that, and perhaps not surprising, that amongst these European regional actors, there was a really strong dominance of a European framing, and Ukraine being seen as part of this Ukraine framing. So it was positioned clearly as one of us, despite what I mentioned in the literature previously about, other scholars arguing that its position is always not so clear cut. So a clear kind of positioning of Ukraine within a European context. There was also a foregrounding of European values. European values were talked about a lot, but when you kind of dig below that a little bit, there was a lack of consensus about what these actually were and the extent to which they were uniquely European. So, for example, there were a number of values that were mentioned by only one of these various European actors that we looked at, such as non-violence and openness to diversity and peace. And I suppose we kind of concluded that this kind of evidence that we were seeing in our data tends to reflect wider arguments about the ambiguity of European values that has been noted in the political science scholarship. So it's been argued by political scientists that the European Union has foregrounded European values as part of its identity building project. But these have typically been highly ambiguous and have allowed politicians to interpret them in very different ways. And so we see a similar kind of lack of consensus playing out in these kind of statements too. Thanks, Lee. Next slide. And then when we move to the national actors, we see a very different framing, a very different spatial imaginary being drawn upon here. And instead of a European framing, it was very much a national framing amongst national organisations. Largely, the European frame was absent from the statements that we looked at here. This was especially in the countries that I suppose could be considered more Eurosceptic, such as the UK, Hungary, and Poland. And it was interesting that often in these statements, we see the same values discussed as those that were talked about by the European supranational actors, but not understood as European. So, for example, freedom and democracy were discussed typically by both national actors and European actors, but framed very differently by the two groups. And when we see what kind of communities are being kind of emphasised or brought about by the statements from national actors, we see emphasis on not a European community, but much more an international or global one. However, the most common geographical framing wasn't necessarily an international or global one, but a bilateral relationship. And we see this referred to time and time again. So just one example, the German Rectors Conference, for example, talked about the impact of the conflict on terms of both Germany's relationship for education research, collaboration, student exchanges, etc., with both Russia and Ukraine. So the kind of damage to the bilateral links rather than damage to a European community or even an international community. Back to you, now, Lee.
Right, so I'll walk you now through the actors' responses to Russian aggression specifically, starting with the regional actors. So with both the regional and the national actors, in the next slide, it's useful, I think, to delineate the findings in terms of discursive strategies, material strategies, and then the exemptions that were afforded to individuals. So with regards to the discourse that the regional actors employed, there was consistency for the most part, actually fairly strong consistency with explicit condemnation of Russian aggression, always positioning Russia outside of the regional higher education space as a result of its actions and the fact that, well, couching it in the fact that it didn't reflect European values in some way. And so this was regularly articulating European values in the way it would frame things. For example, I think the ACA said that it violates European values, which are the principles of the ACA, its member organizations, and the European higher education sector itself. And that was quite common. But on the material strategy side, there was variation. There was greater variation, and this depended on whether they were a more normative, influential organization or a material governing type of actor. So the European Commission announced in its statement the suspension of new and existing cooperation projects with Russian research organizations and payments under Horizon Europe. And similarly, the signatories of the Bologna follow-up group, they all called for suspension of Russia's rights of representation in all Bologna activities. And this was also voiced by EURASH, recommending its members cease all cooperation with Russian institutions. But the EUA, the Universities Association, they were a little more cautious, and they were only recommending its member universities and leaders verify and ensure that they only engage in new collaborations in Russia where they were based on shared European values. And so there's some differences here. With exemptions, European actors' recognition and exemption of individual Russian scholars, students, and dissidents, it directs our attention beyond the national scale to understand how higher education actors operate. In the case of the EUA, the European Universities Association, there was a call for a continuation of existing collaborations on a case-by-case basis, where the other ones, Bologna follow-up group, the ERC, the EURASH, Guild, UFE, they're all calling for a recognition of dissident Russian academics. But what's interesting to the backdrop to this is sort of the absence of a nuanced position from European actors like the Commission, the Students' Union, and the ACA, who took a more of a blanket position on discontinuation of relationships. Now onto the national actors side, there was much greater variation in the discursive strategies shown by the national actors that we looked at, both in the content and the political positions that they took up. From direct and scathing UK, France, Germany, to a more oblique condemnation from Poland, to pretty much absent entirely from Hungary. That's not to say that Hungary didn't make statements, they did, but they avoided identifying Russia as an aggressor and would just talk about the conflict as a problem and sort of mitigations that are put in place. So in terms of material strategies, there were calls for punitive measures from the funding agencies of Western Europe, but then no calls for sanctions from either the material actors or the normative actors in Poland or Hungary. In terms of the exemptions, there was greater alignment in France and Germany, at least, between across all of its various national actors, calling for more or less the same things, the same sorts of responses. But the UK and Spain, interestingly, showed some contradictions, and this I think highlights some of the agency that universities and other non-governmental actors have. Just to give you an example, Universities UK they didn't support a blanket suspension of academic links with Russia. And they were arguing that scientific collaboration and research are a vital global endeavor, and that many Russian students and academics and researchers, at their own personal peril, have publicly criticized the invasion. And that's in contrast with the UKRI and the Minister of State for Higher Education, who both emphasized the need for alignment with the government and compliance with sanctions. And then again, Poland and Hungary, as I mentioned, were absent positions in any direction, except for I think a Hungarian university that recognized the need to protect Russian students enrolled in its universities. So just to wrap that up, we have examples of tensions here between universities and national governments, and widely differing geopolitical positions among the similar actors across Europe. And so these are reflective, I think, of both the geopolitical agency of universities and non-governmental higher education actors, and they're reflective of varying spatial imaginaries of Europe and its higher education space.
Okay, so just to conclude, really, and just sort of spell out some of the messages that we've been talking about over the past few slides. So first of all, in relation to spatial imaginaries, it seemed in our analysis that only organisations with an explicitly European remit, so those European organisations, draw on European spatial imaginaries. They were largely absent from the statements of the national actors. And also, I think in relation to those national actors, there was little sense of a kind of a collective European we under attack, much more a sense of the dominance of bilateral nationalist understandings of we standing with them in that kind of context. And I suppose we would argue that perhaps this was a manifestation of underlying nationalist orientations of an incomplete Europeanization process.
So we found that the findings kind of conformed with what we might anticipate based on national actors' geographical and relational positions within the European Union and within the regionalization project. However, we also see evidence of that heterogeneity among various national actors. And this again points to the agency of organizational actors discursively or materially shaping geopolitical positions, which are not always harmonious with the positions of their national governments. In the context of the European higher education space, the agency of higher education actors, it's pertinent to the contestation of the space itself. And so how actors frame and articulate spatial imaginaries in the public statements is essentially a geopolitical act. Who's in, who's out, which or whose values represent Europe, and what higher education's role in the European project should be. Those are all articulations of the space. And so lastly, we observe how some non-governing, non-state higher education actors can act as geopolitical agents and challenge their government's positions or orientations with regards to international affairs. And that highlights what we already know. The universities are not always in the pockets of national governments, but also how they can push back, right? And they sometimes subtly or circumvent their government's policy positions in interesting ways that are suggestive of their power and agency. So we look forward to discussing and taking your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel and Lee. Perhaps I'll just ask one question whilst others, colleagues, think about any of the others they may want to add. You mentioned, I think, early on the difference between the actors in terms of some of them have discursive roles and some of them have real power. In other words, they're funders and regulators. And I wondered if you identified a difference between the characteristics of the statements between those two categories, given you might argue that one category has more at stake. And similarly, and it may be difficult to do this at this point, but it could be an interesting piece of further work, the gap between what the people say and what they ultimately do. I wondered if you had any insights on that, or that second issue could be a further piece of work.
Yeah, so I think that second question is probably a separate piece of work, but it would be interesting to do. In relation to, I suppose, the stuff that I was talking about, the spatial imaginaries, I think one of the striking things there was that there weren't actually any differences between the kind of, the remit of those organisations, if they were European, irrespective of whether they had any material power or not, they tended to kind of foreground this European framing, whereas the national actors, irrespective again of their power, tended not to frame things in European ways. And it was that kind of national with either the international or the bilateral focus there. So it was interesting that in those kind of discursive terms, there wasn't actually any difference between the organisations in relation to I suppose their power in such matters. Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about the. No.
Sorry, you handing over to Lee there, Rachel, or back to me?
I was asking if he wanted to add anything.
Sorry, no, I think that summarized it nicely. I'm not sure if I would add anything. There's just casual differences in terms of what they could offer in their statements, and maybe how often they would align with government policy more broadly.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Thanks. Susan, I can see your hand. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Hello, Rachel. Good to see you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think it highlighted lots of points that we've obviously coming from a German perspective here to explain where I'm coming from. I was wondering the extent to which, when you were doing your data gathering, you were also taking the time element into consideration, because you presented the different reactions, and I was wondering, because I think that also speaks volumes to some extent about the manner in which many of these large bodies, and some of them are very large, have responded to this particular situation. And did that come into your research? So I think you were nodding, Lee.
Yeah, it did, and that was a concern. That was a methodological criterion we considered early on, as we noted that as we were looking at certain organizations, they had then followed up with an additional statement or nuanced their previous position. Sometimes they would come out with sort of their normative. I mean, their main statement, which would be short and to the point, and then the follow-up maybe a month later would be more guidance related about what they're specifically going to do with students or something like that. I think our position, Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, was it that we would go with the first and original statement issued in these cases, looking at the So and we did specify the time range that we were working within, and I think it was within the first 2 to 3 months after the outbreak of conflict. But then, selecting the first statement that was made based on that.
I mean, just referring back to the German reaction of the HRK, I mean, I was surprised how quick they were. They responded literally the day after the invasion. And to see that happening really was quite a surprise, that there was a consensus reached so quickly that, they slammed out that statement. And that was very unusual, because normally it takes the HRK quite a long time to come up with consensus on things. But so that was a very fast reaction as far as I could tell. And I was just wondering, how quick these, other bodies were in their statement.
Yeah, I think that was probably quite similar across nearly all of the actors that we looked at, because Lee's right, we did take the first statement, but they were all typically in quite a compressed period of time, and it seemed that actually everybody was getting these out quickly. I mean, again, if we had more money and time, it'd be interesting to go back and look at, any modifications to those statements up to the present day. But I think, we just look very much at the kind of first reaction, which was in most cases a very quick first reaction, which I think, yes, is probably quite significant in itself, particularly for those large organizations that, first of all, have to work to get consensus before putting something out.
Any other questions or comments?
Have I got time for one more?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, thanks, Susan.
I mean, one thing as you were going through also struck me in consideration of the present situation that we're in politically worldwide. I'm referring here to the Middle East, but not just exclusively there. And I'm just wondering something about the extent of double standards, because we see on the one hand, in terms of the Ukraine conflict, an immediate reaction. In other words, holding up the so-called European ideals, criticizing the Russian invasion, which was clearly seen as an aggressor against a state that was doing no wrong, and so forth. And now we have a situation which is pretty much similar, really, in a way. We have an aggressor who has invaded another country, which has not done anything. And yet when I was going online just to check out sort of national statements or, HRK statements from Germany, for example, there's nothing. And I think that's really interesting. What does that say about our values? If we promote European ideals, and I just checked out the values in terms of democracy, freedom of speech, women's rights, the normal things that we hold dear, which are globally regarded, that, why is it then not the case that equally, in terms of this kind of activity, we're not seeing anything of a similar kind? And I'm wondering, what does that say about higher education and values in higher education generally?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, because in the UK, it has risen in relation to my own university. What should it say, if anything, in relation to the professional body, not SRHE, another one that I'm closely involved with. And there have been really heated debates about kind of what the role of public statements is, what the role of public statements from higher education bodies is, plus then all the kind of, the similarities and differences in the specific political situations that we're talking about now. So I think, I think it does raise a whole lot of wider questions about kind of, how higher education bodies do or do not intervene in political debates, when they do, when they don't, and what are the factors there, which also speak, I guess, to the questions Lee was talking about for the agency of higher education bodies as political actors. So I think you're absolutely right, Susan. And I think, that wider context makes it even more interesting, because I think what you observe in Germany is probably very similar in many parts of the UK as well, and probably other countries, I would guess. So I think, yes, it raises, I think, quite important questions about when higher education intervenes and when it doesn't.
And generally thinking about, when we're looking at what's been going on in the elites, so to speak, with, demonstrations of young people who we would regard to have that critical thinking ability, after all, and yet a completely, in a way, uninformed reaction. And this is worrying. I think that, this is something where higher education per se, I think, needs to do some pretty serious self-reflection about what it is, or what our failings are within global higher education, that even when we're looking at, the elites, and they're getting it wrong, so where are we going wrong as society in general, if we cannot differentiate between fact and fiction? And I think that was one of the major issues. Some of the reactions were completely based on fabricated information or non-information. And yet they were very vocal. And I think that is a big issue that we have. And I think that's where higher education really needs to do some hard work, I think. And that ties in with what Nicola was saying a bit this morning about values and so forth. So, yeah. End of story.
And Lee, Rachel, I do want to come back on that. I guess my observation would be there's probably more of a consensus, notwithstanding the nuances you've described, in relation to Ukraine, but universities have found it very difficult to position themselves in relation to events in Israel, Gaza, and it will be quite interesting to do your study and look at the statements in relation to that, because I think that would demonstrate how much more problematic it has been on campuses across Europe and beyond to engage with this, given the very polarized perspectives.
Yeah, but I think even with the Ukraine one, I know in my own university, there was a really big debate about whether it was the position of a university to make any statement like this. And in the British Sociological Association, there was a really similar heated debate at that point about whether it was appropriate for a charity to make a public statement beyond something that was directly its remit. And I think in both cases, the decision to do that then had consequences now in the current conflict for demands for statements from certain bodies. So I think it is quite complex. And I think, the position some organisations took in relation to Ukraine has then kind of, set up certain expectations now for wider political intervention, I suppose. Yeah,
fascinating. Sorry, there's another, should we just pick up this last question? Had there been divergent statements between component universities and their associations? for example, individual universities within UUK and UUK?
I think in relation to the kind of spatial imaginaries that I was talking about, not so, because anything that had a kind of, you know, national orientation, there was broad similarity. Lee, I don't know if in relation to the Russian aggression.
No, I can't think of. So I mean, so universities maybe would issue slightly different guidance around looking after their current Russian international students, or continuing certain collaborations where possible. And to be honest, I can't think of what the exact positions are of the rectors or the universities UK or in those cases, but I don't recall any major tensions between them.
Thank you. Great, thanks Rachel, thanks Lee. So Uday, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and I'll just share my screen and just let me know if you can start seeing my screen.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Rachel, and the wonderful presentation indeed. And just want to say before I start that it's my sleeping time here. So I'll try my very best to be as clear and coherent in my argument. I'm presenting a quantitative study, which I'm presenting some complicated graphs and tables, which make things more difficult, but I'll try my very best. I just would like first to start with a quick personal story to just position myself in this conversation. So this is, as you can see my picture, it's I'm from Syria, and this picture I took in 2015 when I left my country. And it's my house key, and this key like always reminds me of home. And at that year, 2015, it was the year when I started the journey of forced displacement. And with this journey, there was like a lot of uprootedness out of my social, cultural kind of context, dismantling all of my social circles, loss of belonging, survival guilt, and identity crisis, and other things. And for me, the way to resist this and cope with it was to do my PhD. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the moment. And in my PhD, there was like, before I start my PhD, two very personal questions that they were troubling me. The first one is what's going on with my relationship with my home country, Syria, my belonging and identity. And the second question is how can I, or will I, and the Syrian academics who are like myself, exiled ones, can rebuild the higher education sector in Syria. So I took these two personal questions to my PhD, and I'm doing my PhD about these two personal questions. As you can see, there's an element in my PhD on higher education sector. And before I think how I can rebuild this sector, I wanted to understand this sector, the higher education in Syria. And what I will present today is an offspring paper of my PhD. It's called Peeling the Multiple Layers of Inequalities in Free Higher Education, and the case of Syria. So very quick introduction. So there's, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the argument on higher education is a site of social mobility or social reproduction. And there's a lot of evidence that shows every year that higher education is a site of social reproduction. And there's a line of research and also activism from the East to the West to the global South to make higher education free. We have the Fee Must Fall movement in South Africa, the Chilean students movement in Chile and in Philippines, some activism and campaigns, and as I said, a line of research arguing to abandon the fees of higher education. And here in this paper, what I'm arguing is free higher education, if it's not coupled with an inclusive sectoral design and a wider strategy to reduce socioeconomic inequalities, continues to exacerbate and reproduce inequalities in the society. So free higher education is not enough. And I'm presenting a case of Syria that has free higher education since 1970, free higher education for everyone. And in this paper, the methodology that I use to unpack the inequalities that such sector exacerbates is an archival analysis for a database published by the Ministry of Higher Education. It's a 15-year database, around 125 Excel sheets, and there are data on students' enrollments, graduation rates, and they are divided by education type, by level of education, undergrad or postgrad, gender, and faculty and specializations and series. So a big database. And there's also some data on teachers, students ratio in these kinds of different education tracks into higher education. And in my findings, what I found after analyzing this 15-year database, I was a little surprised, to be honest, because in the Syrian context, I grew up with this claim that Syria has an equal higher education, that society is equal and we have free higher education for all. And how can you say it's not equal system? And what I found is that free higher education in Syria exacerbated 4 types of inequalities. The first one is education track-based inequalities based on which education track into higher education, and I will explain what these different tracks, but also specialization-based inequalities. Based on what your specialization, your study, there are certain inequalities also that are being exacerbated. City-based inequalities as well, and gender-based inequalities. So I'll start with the first one and move to the second, third, and fourth. So the education track-based inequalities. So just a bit of a context. In Syria, before 2001, Syria was living a very socialism kind of era. And we had only public sector. We had free education for everyone. We had single track into higher education, which is the public sector. And accessing this public sector was on a national exam. So it's a national exam students do at the end of their school, the 12th grade, they do a national exam. And based on this, they access different specializations in the higher education sector. So people can't really choose their specializations, it's based on their grades. Each grade will land you in certain specializations. However, after 2001, we had a bit of a neoliberal kind of reform and a new president, reformist in principle. And what we had multiple sectors. We had private and public and the joint sector between public and private. We had free and non-free higher education. We had multiple tracks into higher education. We had virtual learning for those who want to study just virtually, open learning for those who want to study just weekends, private universities, technical institutes, and higher institutes as well. So different tracks basically into higher education. And the access still based on the national exam for those who want to access the public sector. So the public sector continued to be on national exam. However, the private sector and other tracks are all based on your financial capacity and ability to pay for the fees. And when I looked at the graduation rate for these different tracks that we have, what I found is a shocking kind of numbers. For example, virtual learning, as you can see here on the very left, 3.5 the graduation rate, the average for 8 years, but technical institute and higher institute, 22.5. So your chance is basically almost 8 times to graduate from higher education if you access the technical institute or if you access the higher institute. And we can see the public sector 9.6, the graduation rate, the private sector 13.3. So it's a lot of inequalities based on the track that students land in. And what we know is that, for example, open learning has a very low quality education. There's a lot of work and research has been done on this. We know that student-teacher ratio between private and public is also big. For public, 50 students for each teacher, but the private is 12 for each teacher. So we can see that there's massive teacher ratio difference between public and private. Here I, by mistake, just mixed the numbers. The public is the 50 and the private is the 12:1. We know that technical institute is 2 years and there's an incentive schemes. Those who graduate with high grades will progress into universities from institute to universities. So that encourages a lot of people to finish and graduate. And also it's 2 years. So it's expected that the graduation rate will be higher. And the higher institute that has, for example, 15.8 average graduation rate, it's supported by the EU at that point, and it's private. So we know these differences. And here what this graph shows that these different tracks lands people and gives people different opportunities and chances in graduate. And these different tracks doesn't have the same quality in their design and doesn't have the same private student-teacher ratio, and that impacted to a certain degree the graduation rate. The second thing that I looked at is the specialization-based inequalities based on the specialization that people study. And what I found, just a bit of a context as well. So as I mentioned, Syria had always the single track admission policy. Based on your national exam, you enter and study certain specializations. And these specializations, this single track policy created a hierarchy of specializations in the Syrian context. If students, for example, finish with above 95%, they study medicine. Above 90, engineering. Above 85%, they finish the national exam, they study economy, and so on. And this difference in specializations, the way that there's a hierarchy, was reflected in the society as well, and chances of people even to find careers, but even also to, unfortunately, to marry in the Syrian context, to marry if you're a doctor or you're an engineer or you're and someone who is in these top positions, even your chances in the society is different. So there is this hierarchy of specialization that this single track admission policy created. And when I looked at the graduation rates between these different tracks, what I found is, I'm sorry for if it's a complicated graph, what I just maybe want you to understand for now is that the average graduation rate in these specializations is 10.7%. And there are specializations where graduation rate is below, and some specializations where graduation rates is higher. And here what we can see, for example, if someone studied dentistry, the graduation rate is 15%, and whereas if someone studied, let's say, tourism, the graduation rate is 5-6%. So the chances to graduate if you access dentistry is 3 times higher to graduate than if you access tourism. So there is also inequalities in graduation rates based on these specializations. And an interesting observation that all these specializations that have high, or not all, the majority of those who have high graduation rate, these that are underlined by red, they are the same one in the hierarchy of specializations at the top. So it seems like there's some sort of a correlation between how esteemed this course and the graduation rate as well in universities based on specializations. And also another observation, I tried to understand why we have these different inequalities based on specializations. And what I found is, I created this graph. It's, again, sorry if it's complicated, but the summary of it is I put all faculties, the first row, and I arranged them based on the student-teacher ratio. So if we can see, the law faculty has 1 teacher for every 164 students, and whereas the petrochemical engineering has 1 teacher for every 11 students. So I arranged them based on the higher student-teacher ratio. And also there's another ratio that I found could explain the situation, is the student internationally trained teacher ratio. So universities send PhD scholars to study abroad and come and teach these internationally trained teacher. And we have for example, the faculty of law, 1 internationally trained teacher for every 1,614 students. Whereas in medicine, at the very bottom, or in petrochemical engineers, we see how the ratio is different. And what I found is that student-teacher ratio is linked to graduation rate. Here, all 9 out of 12 of these below average student-teacher ratio, 9 out of 12 of them, they have very high student-teacher ratio. And there's a correlation between the high student-teacher ratio and the graduation rate. And we can see also those who have good student-teacher ratio, 11 out of 12 of the bottom 12 specializations and faculties which have good student-teacher ratio, 11 out of 12, they have above average graduation rate. So that also shows that free higher education is not enough if we don't really design the sector in a way to have more quality and similar ratios between different specializations as well. And also what I found is that student-teacher ratio follows the hierarchy of specializations that I mentioned before. All of these esteemed courses in the society, they have good student-teacher ratio. So we don't know what causes what. There's no like regression analysis in this study. It's more descriptive analysis. But we can see that the numbers, there's correlation between how esteemed the course, the student-teacher ratio, and the graduation rate. The city-based inequalities as well, we found. And Chris, please tell me, I can't see you. If I'm over time, please just feel free to open the mic and let me know.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the city-based inequalities, I also found this in the free higher education system in Syria. And just a bit of a context, we have 14 cities in Syria, but we have just five cities have public universities. For some reason, the government, when they design this free public universities, they have just 5 big universities in 5 cities. And they have branches in the other cities, but these branches, they don't offer all courses. And that's when I looked at the access to higher education based on cities, I also found very interesting observation. So this, for example, Damascus, the first line I'm now explaining, Damascus is the capital. The percentage of Damascus population out of the total population is just 8.75. However, the access of students from Damascus to higher education is 11.8. And the access of students from Damascus to postgraduate studies is 17.3. And we can see that all cities that have big universities, we can see that the students from those cities are privileged because, of course, like logically, there are universities in their cities. They don't need to move to another city. So there's less barrier to access higher education. So that's, again, another example how free higher education, if we don't have universities in all cities, then this is, again, privileged different cities than other cities. And universities' location and socioeconomic background seems to impact access. This is well documented in literature as well. And there's other cultural and other kind of factors that I couldn't unpack. There's no enough literature on them to unpack. It's just my personal understanding of the context. I'm not going to present them here because, again, they are just my personal understanding, how some kind of cultural, social factors impact access. But also something I found very also like problematic in the design of the free higher education in Syria is that not all courses are available in all cities. And in this table, for example, what I try to do is try to see, for example, media, the first course. If you can just, I'll try just to explain the first line, just to explain this table. So media as a course, it's only taught in Damascus, in one city in the whole Syria. And I'm sure political scientists can explain how authoritarian regimes design certain critical courses such as media in the capital just to keep control of the course. However, what we can see, for example, media, it's just taught in Damascus, and Damascus population is just 8.75%, but the access is 23 from the students of Damascus. And the sport, the second kind of specializations, we can see that it's only taught in 3 cities. These 3 cities, the population is 21% of Syria. However, their access to this course is 61%. So clearly, where the courses are located impacts access. And lastly, gender-based inequalities. So what I try to do is also try to understand the access based on gender. And what I will explain is just where the, blue arrow, this is the access. We can see the access is 50-50 based on gender across higher education in Syria, which says something good. However, if we look at the details, we start seeing that, for example, the private sector, only 32% female access and 68% male access. The same thing, higher institute, only 31%. And these 2 are private and the most esteemed in Syria. And there's also some literature and explains that in certain cultures, there is more preference for the male to access. If there's like money allocated for education, that unfortunately usually goes to males in a lot of times. And that could explain some of these inequalities. What we can see also on the green arrow is that graduation rate for females is higher. And this is also something in the Syrian context that there is military conscription and a lot of male students, they delay military by staying in higher education. And that also disadvantages males in different ways than females. So that could explain why, for example, males' graduation rate is less. And also, but what we can see is that gender dynamics are changing in the Syrian context because of the conflict. In the year 1, if we can see the public universities, 40% of female were accessing higher education, postgraduate. Then year 2 in 2010, we have 44%. And year 3, 2015 is 46%. And we can see a trend that the access is becoming higher. And again, unfortunately, in conflict contexts where males are being conscripted and the majority of the people who died in Syria are males and those who immigrated also are males, that could be also explains the trends how female access is becoming more than even males in a lot of times. And also in the labor force, we can see that females total, if we look where the red lines are, we can see the 14-year average for females is 31% of the labor force. In 2001, female labor force was only 24%. In 2015 is 41%. So there is also a trend changing. The dynamics are changing in the Syrian context, in the higher education. And the same things for scholarships. Those students who are sent abroad, we can see that in 2015, it's 54% females. This is different from how the situation was in 2001 as well.
Do you want to wrap up in a sec, Uday? Then we can. I know there's at least 2 questions in the chat, so it'd be great to be able to address those.
That's. I think I'm done. I'm just want to say
Thanks.
that future research can just try to unpack further the relationship between the social and economic development of regions and higher education, and unpacking different kind of inequalities based on sect and disabilities. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much, Chris, for letting me know.
That's terrific. Thank you, and thank you for sharing your personal story at the start. There were 2 questions in the chat, and I had a kind of clarification question as well. So I think the first from Susan related to how you factor in bachelor's and master's routes within the tracks. I wonder if it's just saying what the tracks are that you're capturing here.
Of course. Thank you so much, Susan. So basically what I mean by track is the different kind of access to higher education. There's private universities, there's public universities, there's virtual universities, there's open learning, just weekends, there's institutes. So these are the different tracks. I wasn't referring to track by postgrad or undergrad. But if we look, there are inequalities based on postgrad and undergrad. I didn't present it here. For example, gender. If you look at postgrad, we will see the gender access is dropping dramatically because, again, postgrad usually is to gain more economic opportunities in the society. And a lot of females there might feel that by undergrad, this is the target or the goal, and they might not necessarily use the degree for economic opportunities. So there are different motivation, to access postgrad and undergrad in the Syrian context, and that disadvantage females, for example, in the Syrian context. Thanks.
Zakaria had a question about how you account for entry qualifications. So to the extent to which entry qualifications will inevitably influence performance, graduation rates on the degree course that is chosen. So to what extent that factors into your thinking?
So basically, if I understand you correctly, Zakaria, is that
If I could reformulate the question,
yeah, sure, please.
So yeah, my concern was that you were presenting lots of numbers here and interpreting them as inequalities, right? So in this particular case, my concern is when you presented the numbers in terms of tourism and the graduation levels being very low, and then dentistry and the graduation levels being 3 times higher. And you also told us beforehand that there is a general exam that people have to pass, and if you had a higher grade, then you qualify for better classes, right? So better, courses that you choose to pursue. So my guess from having interaction with other educational systems of the same sort is that the passing level in order to study tourism is much lower than the passing grade in order to study dentistry. And if that's the case, then you are going to have a selection in your data, which means that the students that you are looking at in dentistry tracks are more motivated or better in one dimension or another. And that is what actually explains that they graduate more, or they are more likely to graduate rather than the students in a tourism sector. So this might not be an indication of any inequality.
Thank you so much, Zakaria. No, that's actually a very important point. And it's very difficult to unpack really the causes of these inequalities. I wasn't really focusing on the causes because the causes is a bit of a complicated kind of thing. And you need usually qualitative data that tries to unpack why, for example, students who are going to tourism are not graduating enough. Some people would say it's the motivation. Some people would say those people didn't do good in school, which logically speaking, they will not do good in universities. So there might be a lot of reasons, but in my data, what I found is that there's clearly teacher-student ratio, for example, is something we can see it not just in tourism. We can see it in 10 specializations or in 20 specialization. We can see teacher-student ratio is having an impact, having some sort of an impact. And there's a lot of actually also research and literature on how student-teacher ratio could really make a difference. So I'm not saying this is the sole cause or the sole reason. There are a lot of factors. I'm sure it's more complicated than any database can explain. But here I just try to show that student-teacher ratio seems to have an impact in a way or another.
Yeah, and interesting possible work linking together any data on entry qualifications and what you're seeing in the graduation rates and success in university. Lee, last question. I can only read your first part of this. I wonder if you might want to come in and ask the 2 points.
Sure. Hi, thanks for the great presentation there. First one is a short question about the gendered inequalities that you hit on at the end. How do those parse by major or discipline? Are the gains that you were suggesting over the years leading into the conflict, are those reflected across different degree types, or does it tend to skew in certain directions? That's the first question I want to ask.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking right now at actually just the table to see if I presented anything related to gender inequalities by discipline. I'm sure in my database, I unpacked some of these kind of inequalities. So what I can tell from the data is that those courses who are only taught in certain, for example, media, just in Damascus, that shows that males accessing media more because females who are, let's say, living in the northern part of Syria, they can't travel 700 miles and live in a different city just to access this course. And this is unfortunately, females in a lot of time are limited by the convenience of the specialization. If a specialization is just next door, then they will access it more than a specialization if in another city. So what I can tell you is that the more we just limit and make the courses exclusive to certain cities, the more there's disadvantaged females. Because in the Syrian context, moving to a different city is not easy. Even for males, is not easy. For cultural, for economic reason, other reasons. So this is one way how gender and discipline, there are like this, not overlap, just like some interaction between these two kind of inequalities, double marginalizations in a lot of times for females. I'll stop here maybe to leave room for my third speaker, for the third speaker.
Thank you. And with respect to my second question, I'll take it off. We'll chat online.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, and thanks, Uday, and particularly thanks for staying up in the middle of the night to do this with us.
It's my pleasure.
So, Zachariah and Natalia, over to you.
Great. I'm just putting.
Yeah.
You see the slides, right?
Good.
Okay.
So hello, everyone. We would like to present today the results of a study that was conducted within a Fulbright research project. And today we'll talk about the inclusive global educators for the 21st century, from challenges to advantages. And more specifically, we will focus on what can institutions do to support inclusive pedagogy or inclusive teaching and learning. And we will do it more specifically by presenting, first of all, the context of the academic debate and policy context with regards to inclusive teaching and learning. We will then move to the conceptual underpinnings of inclusive pedagogy. Then we'll present the research question and the significance of our research. And then I will pass the floor to Zach, who will present the survey and the methods, and more specific results, and the implications and recommendations of our study. And in the end, of course, we'll conclude. When we talk about the context, we have to acknowledge that in the last decade or so, there have been various challenges and new developments in higher education that have been calling for more inclusivity in general, but also inclusive teaching and learning, or more broadly understood as inclusive pedagogy within higher education. And in the post-COVID-19 era, inclusive teaching and learning have been key issues facing higher education researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. Scholars agree, on the one hand, that there is a need to foster more inclusive teaching and learning approaches, and this is specifically needed to achieve the success of student learning in a broader way, and also in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 4, inclusive and quality education. This is particularly salient in light of the increasing student diversity, which is the result of various societal changes, such as, for example, the increasing number of refugee crises, such as the massification and the marketization of higher education sector, but also linked to the internationalization of higher education, with more and more diverse student body being present in the classroom, and this domestic versus international student divide not being able to allow achieving successful student learning for all. So we can also notice that policymakers have been really concerned, aware and concerned about reflecting their objectives with regards to more inclusivity, more inclusive teaching and learning within the higher education strategies, action plans, and this has been also often linked to their engagement with the Sustainable Development Goals in general, or the so-called global dimension, global engagement. However, what is important to know is that while inclusive teaching and learning is perceived by academics and policymakers alike as a solution for tackling diversity, campus diversity, societal diversity, the concept of inclusive pedagogy and the understanding of it has been highly debated on the one hand, and this is because of the fact that there are different conceptual underpinnings that are linked to the philosophical dimensions of inclusion in general. When we talk about inclusion perceived as ethical values such as decency, respect, and solidarity, and how this should translate in practical measures such as teaching and learning activities or the type of assessment in an inclusive way within the higher education sector. Of course, we can also notice that there are initiatives within the higher educations worldwide in order to tackle inclusive teaching and learning challenges. But unfortunately, often the performative market-driven context of higher education limits the actions of university leadership and faculty also to the implementation of quick fixes. And these are often related to the need to tackle student feedback or rankings, university rankings, or retention. Within this specific context, our study aims at advancing the academic debate, but also providing some specific recommendations with regard to the practical levers in order to promote and to foster inclusive teaching and learning within higher education institutions. Before doing that, we would like to highlight how exactly our study relates to the existing scholarly debate. And I would like to refer to a recent study, a systemic scoping review of inclusive pedagogy articles, English language articles, conducted by Stantiford and Koutouris in 2021, published in Studies for Higher Education. And the conceptual and the underpinnings of inclusive pedagogy, according to these scholars, can be summarized to two categories. One is the commonality approach, and another one is the individuality approach. So based on their analysis between the 2002 and 2022 period, 2020 articles, they have concluded that most of them are based on the so-called commonality approach. And this understands inclusive pedagogy as inclusion as respecting common student needs, or inclusion as making the difference invisible. So in order to understand a bit better what exactly it means in practice, inclusive pedagogy is treated as one and the same with basically universal design principles, whether we talk about universal design for learning or for instruction. And here is a list of some studies that adhere to this approach. So as you can understand, this is a rather limited view and approach to inclusive pedagogy. And this is the opposite of another approach that is called individuality approach, where inclusion is understood as addressing the individual needs of students and appreciating difference and equity. So this group of scholars, which unfortunately in this study represent less than 20% only, compared to the first group, which is dominated by American studies and American scholars affiliated to American universities, this group of scholars, they are more broadly representing Anglo-Saxon world. Unfortunately, again, it's quite limited to a specific type of academic culture environment, but they highlight the lack of a single approach to inclusive pedagogy, arguing that this is intrinsically linked to instructors' identity, and therefore whatever actions are done to promote inclusive pedagogy have to keep this in mind. This being said, our research question therefore aims at specifically examining what institutional levers are effective in promoting inclusive pedagogy across the United States and the European Union space. This was also the focus of the Fulbright research. And the significance and originality of our approach rely on adhering to individuality approach as a conceptual underpinning. So we do not treat UDL and inclusive pedagogy as one. We specifically have two variables in our study for each of them. We move beyond the Anglo-Saxon world and we compare American practice with the European Union countries. And we also advance the research on specifically on practical implementation of inclusive pedagogy in order to broaden our understanding of how can we move beyond the institutional quick fixes and what can the institutions do. We use an original data set from 2022 international survey, but we also built on a previous US survey. So that validated the operationalization also variables with the experts and practitioners from higher education. And I would like to give the floor to Zachary.
Okay, thank you. So as you already understood, our paper or our research relies on a survey which was conducted in 2022 across the two geographical regions. So we have United States and European Union with the purpose of contrasting these two geographies. This is a online implemented survey which has everything which is self-reported, which has its downsides, but of course this is one of the only ways to get any information, any quantitative information about this, which is going to be what we're going to be aiming at. So our number of participants is 253. This is repartition between US and EU. 33% population of sample comes from United States, and 66% comes from European Union. Given our interest in European Union, this is justified. And our basically methodology that we're going to use in order to analyze data is going to be a set of ordered logistic regressions. These are specific regressions which are somewhat different from the usual linear ordinary least squared regressions that we usually employ. And the reason for this is that our dependent variable has a categorical structure. Categorical structure with these categories having clear relation to each other, right? So they are ordered. So and then what we're going to do is what we call a split sample analysis, when we're going to run the same kind of analysis on the data in European Union and the data in United States, and we're going to try to contrast the findings in order to draw some conclusions. Our main independent variable is the level of implementation of inclusive teaching practices, which is a self-reported level of implementation, which is elicited from study subjects on the basis of 4 questions, which are each asked on a Likert scale, 5-point Likert scale. And our 4 dependent variables that we are sort of exploring as the levers, as the potentially potent levers of promoting inclusive teaching practices are as follows. So we have formal incentives for using in inclusive pedagogy. So this is the situation where university basically has schemes for grants or teaching deductions specifically for implementing innovative teaching or inclusive teaching practices. We have so the second lever is the facilitation or provision of online resources linked to inclusive teaching practices. Third one is a support for formal and informal discussions around the inclusive teaching practices. And the fourth one is the provision of specific directed professional development for inclusive teaching practices. So these are 4 levers which previous research has identified, and we are sort of trying to examine their potency in the United States and European Union context. And then we have a set of covariates in order to, make sure that we are comparing apples to apples and are not making any rash conclusions while looking at these data. So this, I would probably in interest of time, I would simply skip this. There's nothing much to discuss. This is simply a descriptive statistics of our variables with some selected covariates, and directly move to a sort of presenting results. Now, a downside of using ordered logistic regression is that there are actually multiple ways of presenting results. You can slice your results in multiple different ways. I would only present 2 slices. So one slice when we are comparing, one slice which is derived from the aggregate data, which pulls both United States and the European Union in order to evaluate the potency of these four levers. And so here what I'm presenting to you is the estimated probabilities of reporting maximum level of maximum possible level of implementation of inclusive teaching practices, and the impact of basically reported level of these levers on that implementation, okay, on that probability of reporting the maximum level of implementation. And what you see here is that we have two levers. So basically, you can think about the potency or efficiency of each of the, or efficacy rather, of these levers as a slope of these curves. Okay, so the flat curve would basically indicate that there is not much impact of this lever. And as you see, basically, when you are looking at the formal incentives, even if there are basically formal incentives are absent in institutions, people, so probability that someone is going to, so a teacher present in this institution is going to report the maximum level of implementation of inclusive teaching practices is about 12%. And if the same institution basically implemented as much as possible the formal incentives, this actually doesn't have much impact on people's motivation or rather people's likelihood of reporting the maximum level of IP, so inclusive teaching practices. And the same goes on with online resources. So these two levers don't seem to be particularly don't seem to have particularly high efficacy, while the other two do seem to have a statistically significant impact on people's or teachers' use of inclusive pedagogy. And that's when you look at these globally. And when you break these down, across US and EU, So this is a slightly different way of presenting the results. We are looking at the average probabilities here, not really the probabilities of reporting the maximum level of implementation of IP, but rather the average probability. So this is the impact on the probability of someone reporting 1 point higher, 1 point higher implementation of inclusive teaching practices. And what you see here is that in the United States, this what we saw in aggregate data, that the professional development lever was somewhat potent, that actually is not present in the United States. When you slice the data across the two, that the only lever which is potentially potent in the United States seems to be the formal and sort of support for the formal and informal discussions of inclusive teaching practices among the faculty. And even that, statistically, it seems to be not particularly significant. It's only significant at a 90% confidence. While in European Union, we have a different picture where professional development, so the specific targeted professional development on inclusion or on usage of inclusive teaching practices seems to be particularly efficient way of seems to be particularly highly correlated with the faculty's feelings on how much inclusive teaching practices they use. I'm trying to be, I'm articulating in a way that in order to make sure that I'm conveying that this is all about the self-reported data and the probabilities that we estimate from the self-reported data, of course. We are trying to draw some causal conclusions through this, but it's very hard given that we are examining this from a survey data. But this is the best we could do. I mean, this is the one way of advancing the literature that we could under the current constraints that we face. So basically, if we want to draw a summary of the results, so we have main results which are based on these 4 main levers, and what we see is that in general 2 of these levers are not efficient in any of the 2 geographies. We see that in US, support for informal and formal discussions, it seems to be somewhat potent. And EU, this lever is potent, but even more potent is the lever of specifically employing professional development practices for encouraging inclusive pedagogy. And so this is what came out from the results that I've also presented, but of course there are certain secondary results which I didn't want to spend time here, which are also noteworthy, and we are pointing this out in the paper which we are writing up as we speak. So what we see, for example, is that the classroom size has an impact on implementation of inclusive teaching practices in the United States, but not in European Union. What we see is that in European Union, even the large classrooms seem to have the difference between the implementation of in large and small classrooms do not seem to be statistically significant. While in the United States, we see that the larger classrooms are actually implementing less inclusive pedagogical practices. On the other hand, what we see is that the STEM and non-STEM difference is existence in European Union. So in EU institutions, STEM fields actually use much less inclusive practices, while we don't see such a difference in the United States. So our sort of policy recommendation here is that sort of there is some kind of a cross-fertilization that can be done between EU and US in order to understand how to manage potentially larger classrooms based on EU examples and the STEM fields based on American examples, so that we don't have such a discrepancy in implementation of inclusive teaching practices. And what we also see in the United States, is that basically their tenure system seems to have an impact on inclusive teaching practices, in a sense that when teachers get tenure, they implement less inclusive teaching practices. So it seems to be that the tenure system, or rather once you, so the act of getting, or not act, the privilege of acquiring a tenure actually provides a shield from the pressure of utilizing inclusive teaching practices, which seems to be the downside of American system in this particular case. And basically on top of this, conclusions, if you want to say last word.
We are aware of the time limit. So in conclusion, very quickly, some implications of our study. If an institution is wondering where to invest in order to embed inclusive teaching and learning and beyond quick fixes, then we would suggest that these should be formal, informal discussions, especially in the US, and professional development in the EU. Not only this will help to embed inclusive teaching and learning and help the university, but it would also contribute to tackling new challenges in higher education linked to the increasing campus diversity and societal diversity, as well as achieving United Nations SDG 4, inclusive and quality education for all. And future research should also, perhaps apart from what Zach said, use complementary data analysis of some qualitative questions on inclusive teaching practice to understand better what works and how it works. So we'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That's terrific. And we've got a very small amount of time for questions. I can't see any in the chat, so I wondered if I might ask you one, which is, oh, sorry, Manny, do you want to come in? University of Nottingham.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Zachariah and Ellie, for the work. Just in sum, from what you got from the survey data was basically a lot of academics like to talk about inclusion. However, they're not really doing anything about inclusion.
Not really. It means talking about inclusion helps implement inclusive teaching and learning. No, that is a potent level, talking. Whether it's informal discussion or formal discussion, particularly in the US. So I would perceive it any form like of community of practice, brown bag seminars, or sharing of good practice, showing how exactly to do it, and really sharing more practical advices. That is a potent level.
Unless you meant, your question was about the average level of implementation of inclusive teaching practices across the board, right? Because what we're looking here is what are the effects. So in how can we increase the level, but the level itself overall, which could be like your question could be interpreted that overall we are talking about a lot about inclusive teaching practices. But when you look at how much people even self-report how much inclusive teaching practices they do, it's overall the averages are actually quite low.
Right, all right.
We didn't present those averages, right? We present the effects on those averages, but the averages overall are low. So I would sympathize with such a statement in a sense that, yeah, we talk a lot, but we don't actually do much. But what Natalia's answer was about how can we encourage people to do more than what we do? And in that case, it seems to be that the talking, or in a special way, in a structured way, could be one way of encouraging people more. So it's somewhat controversial from that perspective.
And the other really interesting question is the impact on the learner of the different approaches, and flagging what you said earlier on about the difference between commonality and individuality approaches. What ultimately is the effect on learners of those different approaches? And that's again probably a different project, but it would be really interesting to know that. Yeah.
With the student perspective in it, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Terrific, thank you. Sorry, we're going to have to stop there. There's really great, interesting insights from that project. We need to move on because there'll be another parallel session starting soon. So could I just say thank you to all of our speakers, Rachel, Lee, Uday, Zachariah, and Natalia. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thanks for joining the session today. Thanks very much.
And thank you for moderating.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Uday. Sleep tight.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.